The air inside the Great Weaver was thick, heavy with the scent of decaying mulch and humid chlorophyll. It was a dense, ancient perfume, entirely unlike the sterile polish and institutional disinfectant that permeated every corner of St. Jude's orphanage. Elian, 11 years old and feeling every single ounce of that age as a crushing weight upon his small shoulders, pressed himself further into the cavern formed by the immense twisting aerial roots of the banyan fig. The Ficus, a sentinel planted perhaps a century ago by a forgotten gardener, offered him sanctuary. Its interior was a living architecture, a dark, cool pocket where the sun was fractured into thin, hesitant rays that barely pierced the dense canopy overhead. Here, the terrible echoing silence of the orphanage, a silence that demanded compliance and punished individuality, was replaced by the low, insistent thrum of life. He could hear the faint subterranean working of the tree itself, the slow drip of condensation, and the frantic high-pitched scurry of hidden insects. He was hiding, not in mischief, but in sheer agonizing fear. Matron Thorne's search had begun 5 minutes ago, announced by the sharp metallic click of her office door slamming shut and the rhythmic, unforgiving tap of her heavy orthopedic shoes on the cracked asphalt of the yard. Elian had disrupted the mandatory silence during the midday meal, a transgression punishable by hours in the windowless supply closet, a space that smelled of old mop water and despair. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid spasms. He could taste the gritty earth where his face was wedged close to the fibrous bark. The rough, corrugated surface of the trunk scraped against the thin cotton of his worn institutional shirt. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, trying to shrink his physical presence to become nothing more than shadow and scentlessness. The tapping stopped abruptly near the perimeter of the ficus's vast root spread, a sound of acute, terrifying focus. Elian froze. He knew that Matron Thorne possessed an unnerving ability to perceive the slightest disturbance, a gift honed by years of managing unwanted children. A deep tremor of panic, cold and electrifying, shot through his limbs. He held his breath until the edges of his vision began to blur into dancing specks of light. He needed to be invisible. He shifted just a millimeter, adjusting the painful angle of his knee pressed against the packed earth floor of the root chamber. As he did, his outstretched hand, navigating blindly in the darkness beneath a curtain of pendulous roots, brushed against something that was not earth bark or decaying leaf matter. It was yielding, heavy, and strangely textured. His skin prickled. Fear intensified, morphing instantly from the dread of being caught by Matron Thorne to the immediate visceral terror of discovering some sleeping creature. A rat, perhaps, or worse, a coiled snake seeking the cool dampness. He opened his eyes just enough to peer downward. The sliver of filtered light was negligible, but sufficient to delineate a shape. It was rectangular, slumped and bulky. It was covered in a patina of green mold, thick layers of dust, and clinging root tendrils that had begun the slow, relentless process of assimilation. It had been there for a very, very long time. He risked moving his fingers again, cautiously testing the surface. It was heavy canvas, coarse and stiff with age and moisture. A thick, brittle strap of leather lay across the top, terminating in a large, tarnished brass buckle. It was a bag, not a backpack, not a discarded laundry sack, but something official, something with a defined shape and undeniable purpose. Even in the gloom, he recognized the faint, stylized lettering stenciled in black on the side, almost entirely obliterated by mold and time. U.S. Mail. A lost mailbag. The enormity of the discovery momentarily eclipsed the fear of Matron Thorne. This object was alien, an intrusion of the outside world, a world of connection, movement, and purpose into the stagnant, isolated existence of St. Jude's. His heart began to hammer against his ribs again, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was a desperate, urgent curiosity. He had to know what was inside. He heard the distinct crunch of gravel as Matron Thorne walked away from the Ficus perimeter, moving toward the main entrance of the building. She was satisfied for now that he was not immediately accessible. A wave of trembling relief washed over him, leaving him temporarily weak. Now he had time, but the time was precious and contingent. He had to retrieve the bag and examine its contents before the next scheduled head count. Working slowly, meticulously, Elian began to extract the object. The dense cluster of supporting roots had grown tight around it, pinning it like a clumsy insect. He used the edge of a shard of broken terracotta pot he kept hidden for scratching drawings in the dirt, his only tool, to sever the smaller, delicate root hairs that had woven themselves into the canvas fibers. The effort was exhaustive. His muscles screamed with the strain. He pulled carefully and steadily until the object yielded with a soft, sucking sound, detaching from the damp earth. He dragged the bag deeper into the Ficus chamber, into the absolute core darkness, where the light became irrelevant. It weighed far more than it should have, a substantial dead weight full of dense material. The smell intensified, an overwhelming composite of old leather, stagnant water, and the sharp, distinctive aroma of aged, dry paper that had been trapped away from air for years. He settled cross-legged, the heavy canvas resting in his lap. His hands, though small, were practiced in delicate work from years of obsessive attempts at repairing broken toys discarded by others. He focused on the brass buckle. It was corroded a dull, lifeless green, fused almost entirely shut by rust and mineral deposits. It took him nearly 3 minutes of intense concentration, scraping away the oxidized layers with the terracotta shard, before he located the hinge pin. He wedged the sharp edge underneath the thick leather flap, pushing with all the strength in his arms. The buckle gave way not with a snap, but a slow, agonizing screech of metal against metal, muffled by the dense bark walls around him. He paused immediately, every nerve ending screaming. He listened. The orphanage remained quiet. The sound, agonizingly loud to him, had mercifully been contained by the great weaver. The heavy leather flap, stiff as petrified wood, peeled back reluctantly. The interior of the mailbag was a black void, untouched by light or air for possibly decades. He plunged his hand inside, encountering a chaotic mass of material. It felt like paper, crisp in some places, but utterly sodden and pulpy in others. He pulled out the first item blindly. It was an envelope, heavy with a substance inside, perhaps cardstock. The paper was the color of weak tea, stained brown and black where moisture had seeped in. He held it up to the fractured light filtering through the roof of the chamber. The stamp was ancient, depicting a serious-looking, long-dead politician. The ink, though faded, was an elegant script, precise and formal. He saw the address. It wasn't local. It bore the name of a town in another state, a place Elian had only seen on maps in the dusty library. A coastal town, far from the central confinement of St. Jude's. His own hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the fragile paper. He concentrated on the recipient's address, to the attention of the matron of St. Jude's Institutional Home for Children. The sender's address was what stole the breath from his lungs. It was a street name he had seen once, years ago, scribbled hastily on the back of a worn photograph. A photo he no longer possessed, confiscated during one of Matron Thorne's periodic clean sweeps of personal property. Clara J. Alston, Clara, his mother. The coldness that had settled in his stomach for years, the dull, aching certainty that he had been unwanted, deposited and promptly forgotten, shattered into 1,000 shards of sharp, agonizing realization. This letter, heavy with the intention of connection, had never reached its destination. He didn't dare tear the envelope. It was too brittle. He found a thin seam, already weakened by water damage, and meticulously peeled the edges apart. Inside was not just one letter, but a folded piece of thick, cream-colored stationery and a small, strangely carved object. He handled the object first. It was a piece of white cedar, smoothed by countless hours of handling, carved into the rudimentary but recognizable shape of a small fledgling bird. Its wings tucked close to its body, it fit perfectly into the hollow of his palm. A small, deep breath caught in his throat. His mother had carved birds. She used to tell him they were meant to fly away and find home. With fingers now steady despite the interior storm, he unfolded the letter. The paper rustled with a painful, brittle sound. The ink was a dark, strong blue, written with aggressive urgency. He couldn't read fast, not because of illiteracy, but because the words themselves were physical obstructions, heavy, emotional weights that arrested his progress. St. Jude's Matron, you must understand the immediate urgency of this correspondence. I have written 3 times previously, attempting to secure a visit, but have received no reply. I suspect my correspondence is being intercepted or delayed. I implore you, as a professional caring for the welfare of vulnerable children, to acknowledge this letter immediately. Elian is my son. I left him with you under duress, believing it was a temporary measure until I could settle the legal battles regarding my financial stability and relocation. The 6-month window I agreed upon is closing rapidly. I have secured stable employment and a safe private residence in Cedar Creek. I have the necessary documentation for the immediate withdrawal of Elian. He must know that he is desperately loved and that this separation was never intended to be permanent abandonment. Please contact my solicitor, Mr. Edmund Shaw, within 48 hours, or I will be forced to pursue legal action based on the denial of parental access. Do not for 1 second believe that I have forgotten him. Elian finished reading, but the words did not leave the page. They burned themselves into the front of his mind, replacing the cold, smooth narrative of abandonment with a jagged, painful truth. He had been stolen by negligence and institutional silence. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in his eyes, blurring the elegant script. He rubbed his forearm across his face, scrubbing away the moisture and the dust of the Ficus floor. This was not simply a piece of information. It was the reframing of his entire 11-year existence. The institutional indifference he suffered was not due to his own lack of worth, but to a deliberate severance. He looked down at the mailbag, now realizing the gravity of the lost contents. It wasn't just his mother's letter, it was a sack of undelivered destinies. He plunged his hands back inside, his movements now driven by a frantic, compelling need for more evidence. The sheer volume of material was astonishing. This bag must have been misplaced years ago, perhaps dropped by a careless carrier and slowly swallowed by the growing roots. He began pulling out the envelopes one by one. They were mostly business correspondence, junk mail and bills, all mouldy and meaningless now. But interspersed among them were more personal handwritten envelopes, addressed to various individuals within the local community, letters meant for farmers, the old schoolmistress, the retired postman who lived down the lane. Each represented a missed connection, a message that never reached its intended recipient. Then he found a stack bound together with a fraying, heavy rubber band, protected slightly better by being compacted. He snapped the rubber band, and the stack fanned out. There were 8 letters in total, dating across a span of 18 months, all addressed to St. Jude's, and all written in the same urgent, flowing hand as the first. He started reading the second letter, dated 3 months after the first. It was softer, tinged with a devastating sadness, suggesting the legal maneuvering had failed to yield immediate results. To the matron, I am devastated by your continued lack of response. I have received confirmation from the court that the papers regarding my suitability were filed correctly, yet you deny my visitation requests. Mr. Shaw advised me that there is no legal basis for this continued refusal. Elian must be growing. I imagine his hair is darker now. Does he still ask about the sea? We used to spend hours by the harbor. Please, I am begging you for a photograph, just some small confirmation that he is well. The silence is unbearable. I am saving every penny to return to the city and fight this in person. I will not rest until he is home. The institutional home had denied the very existence of a loving parent fighting for her child. Elian felt a surge of white-hot, righteous anger, unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was a potent, dangerous emotion that burned away years of internalized shame. He moved quickly through the next few letters. They charted a downward spiral of increasing desperation, from professional demands to tearful pleas. The fifth letter, dated nearly 2 years after the first one he found, contained a shift. The handwriting was different, shaky and less confident, addressed in a heavy, laborious block script. To Matron Thorne. Elian recognized the difference. Matron Thorne's office had intercepted the earlier, formal correspondence. This letter looked like a desperate back-channel attempt. He opened it immediately. "Madam, this is Martha Finch. I am Clara's cousin and have been assisting her in her attempts to contact her son. Clara, I regret to inform you, has been hospitalized. Her health failed rapidly after the last court hearing went against her. The judge ruled she had been uncontactable due to a failure to respond to critical court summons regarding the child's long-term placement. I believe there has been a profound error, perhaps a systemic failure of communication." Clara sent responses. She never missed an attempt. She loved Elian deeply. "I'm now pursuing guardianship. I have a stable home, savings, and the willingness to raise him. Please, I beg you, do not let him languish in the system believing he is unwanted. I can provide evidence of Clara's efforts. She has kept a full record of every letter sent and every phone call made, calls which, she tells me, went unanswered. I will arrive next Tuesday to formalize the request. Please prepare Elian. I want to tell him about his mother's fight, not just the outcome. Martha Finch, 19 Sycamore Lane, Cedar Creek, MA." Elian dropped the letter. It fluttered down, landing on the damp earth. Martha Finch. An aunt he never knew existed. Next Tuesday. He calculated the passage of time in his mind. The date stamped on the letter was over 7 years ago. 7 years ago, when he was just 4, a woman who loved him, a family member ready to take him, had planned to arrive at the gates of St. Jude's. And she never did. Because this letter, this critical piece of documentation proving a familial connection and intention to collect him, lay trapped in the heart of the great weaver. The immediate consequence, the crushing, irreversible consequence, was the loss of his family, based entirely on a bureaucratic accident solidified by negligence. He felt the emotional equivalent of a physical injury. It wasn't just sadness, it was a profound, wrenching pain that originated deep in his chest and spread outward, tightening his throat and constricting his ability to breathe. He had spent his childhood believing he was a burden, a discarded remnant. The reality was far more agonizing. He was a beloved child whose fate was sealed by a lost mailbag. He realized now why Matron Thorne cultivated such a cold, impermeable silence around the children's backgrounds. No questions were allowed, no past lives acknowledged. She protected the institution from the messy, inconvenient truth of family and connection. If this mailbag had contained merely administrative details, it would not have been hidden, but processed. Its disappearance clearly served the narrative of institutional necessity. He had to get out, but he couldn't move. His body felt heavy, anchored by the truth he had unearthed. He spent what felt like an eternity simply staring at the letters, the tangible proof of years lost. He focused on the details, the small tear in the corner of Martha Finch's letter, where she had clearly been anxious when sealing it. The faint scent of something floral that still clung to the paper. Perhaps the perfume Clara had worn. He needed to check the rest of the bag. He could not stop now. The momentum of discovery was too powerful. He scraped away the remaining envelopes, pushing past the pulpy, waterlogged mass at the very bottom. His hand closed around something smaller, harder, and wrapped tightly in what felt like thick plastic. He pulled it out. It was a standard mailing sleeve, the kind used for valuable documents, sealed meticulously in a heavy Ziploc bag, a modern safeguard against moisture, meaning whatever was inside was relatively recent. The date stamped on the sleeve's postmark was only 6 months prior, 6 months ago, long after the bulk of the bag had been lost and settled in the roots. How? Why? Elian reasoned that perhaps the original carrier had been replaced or the route adjusted. It was possible that the carrier, years ago, had stuffed the original lost mailbag into the Ficus cavity in a moment of panic or carelessness. And this recent, smaller sleeve had been dropped in the same easy-to-miss spot much later, perhaps dislodged by a storm and settling against the heavy canvas. The Great Weaver had accepted them both into its vault. This sleeve was addressed to Elian Alston, St. Jude's Home, his full name. He didn't bother looking for a tier. The plastic was thick, designed to protect documents from a journey across the country. He used the terracotta shard again, carefully sawing into the tough plastic until he could pull the sealed document free. It was a single legal-sized paper folded in 3. He unfolded it. It wasn't a letter, it was a printed memorandum. It bore the logo of a legal aid society in Cedar Creek. Memorandum regarding ongoing inquiry. Alston, Elian. To the attention of the current governing body of St. Jude's Home for Children, we continue to receive persistent inquiries regarding the whereabouts and welfare of Elian Alston. These inquiries are generated by Ms. Martha Finch, the stated blood relative, who maintains that previous documentation regarding her successful attempts at obtaining guardianship was deliberately ignored or misplaced by your institution approximately 7 years ago. Ms. Finch is now 82 years old, and her health is rapidly declining. However, she retains full legal capacity and has provided our society with copies of all previously attempted correspondence and legal filings. These documents strongly suggest a history of intentional delay by previous administration. Please note, Ms. Finch's primary goal remains making contact with her great-nephew, Elian. She wishes to transfer her remaining assets and ensure his emotional stability before she passes. She requires verification of his current address for purposes of setting up a legal trust fund in his name. We request, under threat of immediate litigation and a formal investigation into the institutional practices of St. Jude's, the current and accurate physical location of Elian Alston within 5 working days. Please address all future correspondence regarding this matter to the undersigned. Sincerely, Ms. Eleanor Vance, Senior Attorney, Cedar Creek Legal Aid Society. Contact 501-4992. Address 110 Main Street, Cedar Creek, MA. Elian stared at the phone number, the address, the name. It wasn't a ghost of the past. It wasn't just a painful memory locked away by negligence. It was active, right now. His relative Martha Finch was still fighting. She was 82, frail, but still dedicating her final energies to finding the boy the system had swallowed whole. And this urgent legal notice, meant to force St. Jude's hand, was here. Trapped. He pressed the cool, smooth paper against his cheek, inhaling the faint, metallic scent of the fresh copier ink. This was the key. This was not the sentimental history of a lost mother. This was the present-day blueprint for escape and reconnection. The silence of the ficus chamber suddenly felt menacing again. His time was running out. He had processed years of profound emotional trauma in mere minutes, and the raw, exposed nerves of his spirit demanded action. He knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that if Matron Thorne found him with the mailbag, or even a single scrap of the evidence, the consequences would be swift, devastating, and final. She would seize the evidence, destroy it, and place him in isolation so profound he might never speak again. He had to get the documentation out. He looked at the large canvas bag. It was far too heavy and bulky to smuggle back into the orphanage. He had to decide what was essential. He gently placed the cedar carving of the bird into the pocket of his trousers. That was the memory of his mother. He took the first letter from Clara, the one detailing her immediate intention to reclaim him, and folded it carefully, tucking it inside the same pocket. That was the proof of abandonment's lie, and most critically, he took the recent legal memorandum from Ms. Vance, the phone number and the address. This was the future. He did not need the other hundreds of pieces of paper, the stack of Martha Finch's older letters, or the irrelevant junk mail. They were too many, too fragile, and too damning to carry. His focus narrowed to the essential: contact information and proof of history. With a heavy heart, knowing that he was sealing away the rest of the tragic evidence, Elian began the process of re-hiding the mailbag. He carefully pushed the canvas deep back into the recess of the ficus roots. He repositioned the dense earth, the broken bark, and the heavy layer of fallen leaves, making sure that the entrance to the chamber looked undisturbed. He even used the shard to scrape new lines into the bark, making the surface look naturally chaotic again. When he was certain the mailbag was invisible to casual inspection, he sat back, taking a final, deep, shuddering breath of the ficus air. He was no longer the small, fearful boy hiding from the matron. He was a boy holding undeniable proof of his worth, his love, and his true identity. The vulnerability remained sharp and immediate, but it was coupled with a desperate, intense alertness, the urgency of a secret agent carrying state secrets, though these secrets were merely of the heart. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't trust the orphanage phone. He couldn't trust anyone inside the walls. He had to get to the outside world, to a public phone, or find a way to mail a letter to Cedar Creek. The problem was, St. Jude's maintained an effective lockdown. The gates were locked outside of specific visiting hours, and Matron Thorne always knew exactly where every child was. He had perhaps 4 hours until the evening meal and the official check-in. He slowly, meticulously crawled out of the ficus chamber. He brushed the heavy dirt from his clothes, knowing he couldn't eradicate all traces of his underground visit. If he was questioned about the dirt, he would claim he fell during the frantic escape from the dining hall. He heard the distant, muffled sound of the laundry cart wheels squeaking on the institutional tile. A minor, mundane sound, but it signaled the rhythm of the day, a rhythm he now intended to break. He walked cautiously back toward the main building, moving through the periphery of the yard. His mind was racing, formulating a plan that had to be flawless. He needed privacy. He needed a way to use the phone number. Inside the orphanage, the only accessible phone was the rotary dial in Matron Thorne's office, guarded like a treasure vault. The outside world was restricted to a payphone kiosk located 3 blocks away, outside the fence line. The fence. The orphanage was surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence, topped with 3 strands of rusty barbed wire. There was only one point of weakness he had ever observed: the service gate used for utility deliveries. It was secured by a heavy padlock, but the hinges were ancient, slightly rusted, and the ground beneath the lowest panel was eroding. He had examined that spot countless times, not as a means of escape, but simply out of boredom and curiosity. Now it was his focus. He slipped silently through the back entrance of the orphanage and ascended the wooden staircase to the 2nd floor, the area housing the unused, dusty administrative offices. This floor was rarely patrolled, deemed too boring and inconvenient by the staff. He needed a moment of absolute calm to commit the phone number and address to memory. He found a small, neglected washroom and locked the door. He pulled out the legal memo, 501-4992. 110 Main Street, Cedar Creek, MA. Ms. Eleanor Vance. He repeated the information, staring at the numbers until the digits burned behind his eyes. He repeated the address, creating a mental map of what Main Street might look like. He pressed the piece of paper, the paper that promised a future, to his forehead. He felt the weight of the cedar bird carving in his pocket, a comforting, heavy presence. Then, with an agonizing certainty, he shredded the legal memo into the smallest possible confetti and flushed it down the toilet. He could not risk being found with the evidence. The knowledge itself was his weapon. He did the same with the remaining letter from Clara. He had read it, absorbed its truth. The risk of discovery was too great. He unlocked the washroom door and exited, his heart beating a steady, furious rhythm of resolve. He had shed the physical evidence, retaining only the emotional impetus and the critical data. The institution demanded quiet conformity. He would give them a diversion. He descended to the first floor, moving toward the kitchen area, which was currently empty save for Mrs. Perkins, the aging cook, preparing the evening stew. Elian knew Mrs. Perkins took pride in the order of her pantry. He slipped into the adjacent supply closet, grabbed a handful of unused metal soup ladles, and proceeded to fling them one by one into the large, empty copper pot awaiting the stew base. Clang! Clang! Kerrang! The noise was deafening, echoing through the empty halls. "What in the blazes?" shrieked Mrs. Perkins. Matron Thorne, who had been reviewing budgets in her first-floor office, emerged instantly, her face tight with fury. Elian knew he had mere seconds. He bolted toward the back corridor, leading to the gymnasium and the service area. "Elian, stop this instant!" Matron Thorne's voice was a whip crack, full of escalating menace. He didn't slow. He knew the geography of the orphanage better than anyone. He ducked past the janitorial cart, skidded on the polished floor, and reached the heavy, reinforced steel door leading to the rear yard. He threw his full weight against the crash bar. The door shuddered open with a loud, protesting whoosh of air and sound. He was outside. The service gate was 50 yards away. He ran, his thin legs pumping, adrenaline neutralizing the usual exhaustion that plagued him. He heard Matron Thorne behind him now, her heavy footsteps closing the distance, punctuated by her sharp, ragged breaths of rage. "You will return this minute, Elian Alston. You will face the consequences of this willful disobedience." He didn't look back. He focused on the fence, on the specific spot where the ground sloped away. He reached the gate. It was tall, unforgiving chain link. He grabbed the fabric of the wire mesh and pulled, searching for the spot where the fence detached slightly from the concrete base. The erosion was deeper than he remembered. He dropped to his hands and knees, ignoring the pain of the gravel digging into his skin. He saw the gap, a space of about 10 inches, covered mostly by overgrown weeds and stubborn ivy. He had to be small. He had to be quick. He heard Matron Thorne, less than 10 yards away now. He could hear the specific, rhythmic rasp of her clothing moving. He flattened himself, twisting his body, and shoved his head and shoulders through the gap. The rough, jagged wire scraped agonizingly against his ribs and the back of his neck, but he pushed forward. He tasted the dirt and the coppery tang of fear. He felt the heavy leather of Matron Thorne's shoe slam into the fence directly above his torso, shaking the entire structure violently. "Stop! You little beast! Stop!" He scrambled, pulling his hips through the constricted space. He felt the cloth of his trousers snag, but he didn't care. He was almost free. His legs followed, dragging through the mud and roots. He rolled onto the rough grass outside the perimeter. He was bruised, scraped, and panting, but he was out. He immediately jumped up and began running down the street. He risked a glance backward. Matron Thorne stood on the inside of the fence, her face crimson with frustrated fury. She was grasping the chain link, unable to pass the barrier. She didn't have the keys to the heavy bolted padlock, which remained secured. She could only watch him flee. Elian did not slow down until he rounded the first corner, putting the entire oppressive structure of St. Jude's out of sight. He ran 3 more blocks, slowing only when his lungs burned with a searing, desperate pain. The world outside the orphanage was loud, bright, and terrifyingly immediate. Cars honked, people walked by, looking at him with the detached curiosity reserved for a scruffy, running child. He focused on the objective, the payphone. He found the kiosk exactly where he remembered it, outside a small, run-down convenience store. It was a greasy, scratched steel box, emitting a faint, high-pitched dial-tone whine. He searched his pockets. He had nothing, no change. Children at St. Jude's did not possess currency. The bottom dropped out of his stomach. His desperate escape, his life-altering discovery, all depended on a single 10-cent coin he did not possess. He leaned against the sticky glass of the phone booth, trying to steady his shaking hands. He looked at the convenience store. He couldn't go in and beg. He was clearly an escapee, covered in mud and looking feral. He needed money. He thought of the cedar bird, his one possession, his piece of emotional ballast. It had profound meaning to him, but it was just a chunk of wood to the outside world. He walked into the parking lot, his eyes darting across the ground. He looked beneath the benches, near the vending machines. Nothing but candy wrappers and cigarette butts. Despair threatened to overwhelm him. The adrenaline was receding, leaving a cold, hollow exhaustion. Then, near the base of a trash receptacle, glinting in the afternoon sun, he saw it. A dime. Tarnished, wedged between the concrete base and the asphalt. He swooped down, his fingers scrabbling until he pried the coin loose. It was damp and cold, smelling faintly of soda residue. He had 10 cents. He hurried back to the payphone, his hands slick with sweat and grime. He lifted the heavy receiver, the plastic warm from the sun. He dropped the dime into the slot. Clink. He quickly dialed the number he had memorized. 55550149992. The phone rang. Once, twice. Each second was an agonizing stretch of time. He imagined Matron Thorne mobilizing, contacting the police, reporting a runaway. He had maybe 15 minutes before the hunt would intensify and move beyond the orphanage grounds. On the 4th ring, a voice answered. It was professional, crisp, and female. Cedar Creek Legal Aid, Eleanor Vance speaking. How may I direct your call? Elian's throat clenched. The reality of the moment, the actual living voice of the person who could save him, was overwhelming. He tried to speak, but only a dry, desperate whisper escaped. "Hello? Sir? Are you there?" Miss Vance prompted, her tone shifting slightly to impatient. Elian took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to summon the confidence he did not possess. He forced the air past his constricted vocal cords. "Miss Vance," he croaked out. "This is Elian. Elian Alston." Silence hung on the line, heavy and absolute. For a terrifying second, Elian thought the call had dropped, or that he had been disconnected. Then the lawyer's voice returned, entirely transformed. It was stripped of its professionalism, replaced by a sudden intense urgency, an almost disbelieving shock. "Elian? Dear God, is this true? How are you calling? Where are you?" The immediate emotional impact of her genuine concern, the fact that she knew his name, the fact that she was actively looking, unleashed a torrent of emotion. He couldn't hold back the years of suffering. Tears streamed down his face, silent and hot, mixing with the dirt. "I'm outside the orphanage," he managed to say, his voice thick with unshed sobs. "I found the mail. I found the letters, the ones you sent. They never got them." "The letters," Miss Vance repeated softly, the sound of her pen tapping rapidly on paper, audible over the line. "Elian, listen to me. This is critical. Are you safe right now? Are you being followed?" "I ran away. Matron Thorne is looking for me." "Understood. You have proof of the failure to deliver those legal documents. This is invaluable. Do you have the phone number of the matron? We need to verify that we are speaking to you, and we need to activate a safety protocol immediately. Elian supplied the orphanage number, recited from years of being forced to memorize institution details. Good. Now, Elian, you must tell me exactly where you are. I cannot reach you physically. I am hours away, but I can call the local police department and report this as an emergency custody issue, denial of rights and intentional withholding of information. He gave her the intersection, specifying the convenience store. Stay exactly where you are, Elian. Do not move. Do not go back near the orphanage. Do not talk to anyone. I am calling the police in your jurisdiction right now and dispatching them to that location. They will confirm your identity and ensure your safety. They are not to return you to St. Jude's. Do you understand? Yes, Elian whispered. I will also contact Martha Finch. She needs to know this. Hold fast, Elian. You are almost home. The line clicked dead. Elian stood there, the receiver still pressed to his ear, listening to the hollow, humming dial tone. He had done it. The intense alertness, the urgent rhythm that had possessed him since the discovery, slowly began to give way to sheer, profound exhaustion. He lowered the receiver, his hands shaking again, not from fear but from the massive, invisible effort of his self-rescue. He leaned against the booth, closing his eyes. The secrets, years of them, were finally free. He had traded institutional safety for the agonizing vulnerability of the unknown, but he had done it carrying the full, comforting weight of the truth. He was not forgotten. He was fiercely loved and actively sought. Within 4 minutes, the piercing sound of a siren reached him, growing louder rapidly. It wasn't the distant, mournful wail of an ambulance. It was the close, authoritative sound of local law enforcement. A dark blue sedan squealed to a halt directly across the street. 2 uniformed officers exited, moving with purpose. Elian raised his hand, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. He was covered in dirt, his clothes torn, his eyes red and swollen. But in his pocket, the small, smooth cedar bird felt like a shield. He watched the world rushing toward him, the consequences of his immense discovery. It was terrifying, intense, and dramatically overwhelming. But for the first time in his young life, Elian Alston felt entirely, utterly real. He was no longer an orphan defined by neglect, but a survivor defined by the immense, heartbreaking truth unearthed from the root chamber of the great weaver. His journey had begun, propelled by the lost words of love, years too late, yet arriving precisely when they mattered most.